All right, so I am Jason Roberts. I'm a staff developer at Smile Digital Health, and I am currently the technical lead on a CDA import framework project. And so I'm here just to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned through the course of that project about how to import CDAs into Smile, into FHIR. So the first question is, why do we care about importing CDA documents in the first place? And the answer is that CDA is a standard that's been around for a very long time, and there is a huge installed base out there. And we don't want to cut ourselves off from being able to interact with all of those systems. So we might be requiring to retain a connection to an external partner who is communicating with us using CDA and is not able or willing to upgrade at this time. Or we might be managing a piecemeal upgrade within our own systems, where we have some systems that are upgrading to FHIR and others, for various reasons, are not ready to make that shift yet. And in order to keep the information flowing, we do need to be able to import CDA documents into FHIR-based systems and do something sensible with them. We might also be operating in a legislative or regulatory environment where support for CDA remains mandatory, even though we're wanting to use FHIR in-house or under the covers. So what exactly am I going to be meaning when I talk about CDA? So for the purposes of this talk, when I say CDA, I mean Consolidated CDA Release 2.1, simply because this is the one that I'm most familiar with. I know that in the United States, most of the clients that we've been talking to are most interested in converting CCDA documents into US Core 5.0.1. However, we are also aware that there are other implementation guides in use elsewhere in the world. And that was, in fact, our very first and biggest challenge, is understanding the importance of selecting the right implementation guide for the right environment and architecting a system that would be flexible enough that we could deal with the differences between them. Some of the differences are almost trivial, such as a cardinality change that makes mandatory a field that we were going to populate anyways, no real effect. In other cases, they can be quite large. For instance, in US Core, they have a very specific profile for representing blood pressure, vital signs observations that needs to be conformed to, and which is quite different from what other types of observations might look like. And of course, that only applies in the US. It doesn't apply necessarily to any other implementation guide out there. So one big challenge is dealing with viewpoint. FHIR is pretty much a viewpoint neutral standard. When we talk about the allergy and tolerance resource in FHIR, it's simply a clinical statement that a particular patient has a particular allergy or a particular intolerance. But when we look at the corresponding entry in CDA, most of the information that we need to populate that allergy and tolerance resource is going to come from an allergy and tolerance observation entry. However, those in CDA do not stand alone. They are always found wrapped in an Allergy Concern Act. And the Allergy Concern Act is actually bringing along the viewpoint of the prescriber, saying this particular prescriber has a clinical concern about this allergy. There is information we need there. The identity of the practitioner is important, but it also has its own set of fields like status, like effective time, which could potentially override or contradict the equivalent fields found on the allergy intolerance observation itself. The effective time is an interesting case because the time during which the prescriber or practitioner is concerned about the allergy is not necessarily the same time during which the patient is actually suffering from the allergy. Obviously, the practitioner is not going to be able to anticipate an allergy that hasn't manifested itself yet. They may also continue to be concerned about something which has ceased to be clinically relevant, or they may have already considered as no longer of concern something that is still clinically real if the symptoms are mild enough. So we need to be very careful that we're selecting the right times, the right statuses when we have multiple entries in view. We had really hoped that we would be able to establish a one-to-one mapping between the CDA entries and the FHIR resources. No such luck. It's many to many. How does that arise? Whoops. Oh, this is not my laptop. I don't know what to press. So in CDA, we have this thing called mood codes, and the same entry with a different mood code can mean something quite different. The most common mood code is EVN for events representing real things that have happened in the world and which are being tracked. But there are also other ones. Another one that we sometimes see, the second most common, I would say, is intention, representing an intended event, a plan, a proposal, a request. All of those have their own more specific mood codes as well, but they tend to get rolled up into INT. So when we're doing the mapping, when we encounter a medication activity that is the mood code of EVN, something real, something that's in the past, we're probably going to want to convert that in FHIR into a medication administration resource. However, if we encounter one which is simply an intent for a medication activity, that one is more likely to get mapped onto medication request. And because the resources are different resources, the details of the mapping will be slightly different from one to the next. It keeps coming up. What do I press? There we go. So the way that it goes in the other direction is that CDA just loves observations. We have a whole laundry list of different types of observations, all of which are going to map onto the observation resource in a FHIR repository. And then how do we tell the difference? Well, maybe you don't need to. Maybe you're lucky and your business case doesn't need you to track that sort of information, but maybe you do. In some of these cases, like vital sign, it actually maps really nicely onto the observation category value that is right there for you. But in other cases, it's not so clear. And some of the cases, like the assessment scale observation, actually can occur within multiple sections of the CDA document, and it will have a different meaning depending on the context in which it appears. So it can be quite difficult to determine that the corresponding observation resource in FHIR, where it came from and what exactly it represents. So that's also frequently a challenge. Moving on to a more tactical level, or bringing up the context menu again, as the case may be, we have to deal with things like cardinality mismatches frequently. Now, in the direction where we're taking a CDA singleton and putting it into a FHIR list, not such a big deal, because a list can contain one entry, that's fine. But there are a few rare cases, fortunately only a very few cases, where CDA is providing us with a list, but FHIR only wants to accept a singleton, and that is potentially a very big problem. I don't have any general guidance to offer on it. We do have to analyze these on a case-by-case basis and determine what the best solution is. If there's an explicit order, that's helpful, but then you need a little bit of additional context to understand whether the earliest or the latest element in that list is the most relevant and the one that ought to be captured. And if there is no order, or if the order is implicit or completely lacking, then we're left entirely at loose ends knowing how to choose. One important example that we encountered fairly early is that in CDA, almost every entry allows multiple authors. The corresponding field in a FHIR resource, usually something named recorder or asserter, is almost always a singleton. So how do we resolve that? What we ended up doing was having to make a more or less arbitrary choice as to which of those authors to put into the recorder field, but then we capture all the rest as provenance records so that no data is lost. It's all still available if you know where to look for it. Other cases will have other solutions depending on the specific context. In CDA, entries are identified by the II data type, which stands for instance identifier. And this has certain characteristics. Generally, it is mandatory, but it allows multiples. These are generally scoped by some issuing organization or other, and they often have a real-world meaning, or at least are shared among multiple government and business entities. So due to these characteristics, we found that the best practice in general is to map these identifiers onto the FHIR identifier data type, which also allows a list, allows for scoping by the issuing organization. And then we simply allow the FHIR repository to assign an ID, which is a meaningless local identifier, according to whatever its own business rules are. We generally find that gives the best results, but it does bring with it a few complications. One of which is that it does make search a little more complicated because you're searching by the identifier, not by the ID. The other thing is that if you're building up a transactional bundle where the resources in that bundle refer to one another, you often do need to assign temporary IDs so that those connections are retained until things can be finally persisted in the repository and the real IDs assigned. Vocabulary is a huge topic that we've wrestled with quite a lot on our team. I can and have given entire talks about the vocabulary problem. Fortunately, in a lot of the more clinical fields, the value sets that are bound to draw from the big international code systems like SNOMED and LOINC, and these can simply be used as is on either side in either model. However, we do have one detail to pay attention to. In CDA, they prefer, as you can see in the example on the right, to identify the code system using an OID. That's the left. And in the example on the right, which is FHIR, we are identifying these using canonical URIs. So at the very least, we needed to set up a lexicon for converting those two types of identifiers into one another and be referring to these things by their preferred format in each standard. Now, sometimes it's not the case that the value sets are compatible in this way. That sometimes is found in the more syntactic fields, things that represent statuses, things that represent types and categories. And in these cases, we find that the value sets are defined in entirely distinct ways. Here's an example, which is the clinical status of an allergy intolerance. And on the CDA side, this is identified using a LOINC code. There's a small value set containing about 7 or 8 of these. And on the FHIR side, we have a value set, a code system that has been defined by HL7 for representing this concept. And we do need to do the transformation between these, and we have found that this is an ideal use case for concept maps. We have several dozen concept maps defined in our system to handle these translations back and forth. Sometimes it gets even more complicated than that. We get systems where there is some pre-coordination. In this case, which is the allergy and intolerance. In the FHIR, we have 2 distinct fields, type and category, one of which distinguishes whether it's an allergy or an intolerance. The other distinguishes whether the allergy is to a medication, to a food, to an environmental substance. On the CDA side, this has all been rolled up into a single field, which is the value of a, what entry is that? I don't remember off the top of my head. But it's a single code, as you can see here in the example, that indicates an allergy to drug. It's got both of the category and the type rolled up in one. And in this case, the best solution we were able to find was simply to translate that particular code twice. The last thing that we have to deal with is the case where there is data that is missing from the CDA document. Often you don't really care. If the field is optional in FHIR, then your business case may be that you can simply leave that field unpopulated if the data is not available to you in a particular CDA document. But sometimes the profile will make that field mandatory and you have to do something. In CDA, they have this concept of null flavor, which anyone who is familiar with CDA probably loves to hate. I know I do. The corresponding structure on the FHIR side is an extension called data absent reason. And we also have a concept map set up to map between the null flavored code system and the data absent reason code system. There is one interesting exception to this, which is that the observation.value field does not take this extension because it has its own little field that comes along with it, which is the recipient for that data absent reason code. It's bound to the same value set, but it's a explicit field in the structure of the observation rather than an extension. I'm not sure why that is. It's probably a complicated historical reason. And that brings me to the end of my prepared slides. So just in time. So I'll turn it over to Q&A. Please wait for Tim with the microphone so that we can capture the questions on the recording.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about the many-to-many examples or cases that you mentioned. So we're kind of expecting this whole thing to happen automatically, like the conversion, right? CDA to FHIR. So you said these specific cases, you need to analyze it on a case-by-case basis. So what will happen when we are importing these CDA data? Is it going to fail? Like, how do you do the analysis?
No, the analysis has already been done. It's been done by our business analysts when we were defining the mappings. And so there's no decision to make at runtime when we're running the tool. We know, we've already done the analysis. We know that when we see a particular set of data within a particular CDA entry, that we know how to map it. But the BAs did have to spend quite a lot of time and do quite a lot of very fine reading of the specifications in order to determine those business rules for us.
Came in a little bit late, so I don't know if you touched on this, but did you do the opposite, FHIR to CDA at all?
We do. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk because it's a community talk and I was limited to just 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But yes, we do convert in the other direction as well, and that brings along with it its own set of problems.
Oh yeah, like URIs that don't have voids or...
Oh yes, yes, absolutely.
Do you keep any kind of provenance or something, like when you do a transformation, like when was transformed from where, and then like what version of the software transformed it or something like that?
Yes, we do. We create a number of provenances as part of this. As I mentioned when I was discussing the authors, we do create one provenance for each unique pair of practitioner and timestamp that we find in the body of the document. We also create one master provenance, which contains all of the metadata that you just mentioned, as well as a link to the original document exactly as we received it for auditing purposes. And all of the resources that are extracted from that document will then be linked to that master provenance so that you can always tell this data came from that document.
So we're just out of time, but Jason's available for more questions after this. Thank you very much.